Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, so today we're diving into something we literally interact with every single day, because we are looking at the high-stakes world of beverage marketing and corporate accountability. We all buy drinks, right? Sports drinks, sodas, bottled water. But how often do we really look at the label and consider the massive web of financial, legal, and reputational risks attached to every single claim printed on that bottle? Today, we're decoding the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, guidelines for the non-alcoholic beverages sector, specifically looking at the risks and rewards of product labeling and marketing.
I want you to start by just asking yourself, how much is a misleading beverage label really costing the company that made it? Think about your own experiences. When you grab a drink and the label says all natural or 0 calorie, you instantly build a little bit of trust with that brand. But when those claims turn out to be exaggerated or just outright false, the financial weight of that deceptive marketing can be utterly catastrophic. We're not just talking about a PR headache here. It is a very real, measurable financial liability.
All right, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit 5 key areas. First, the marketing minefield. Second, targeting the next generation. Third, the GMO transparency demand. Fourth, the cost of deception. And finally, we'll wrap up with the bottom line. Let's get right into it.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the marketing minefield, where we decode the SASB standards. Now, looking at this SASB standard for the non-alcoholic beverages sector, notice how product labeling and marketing is actually carved out as its very own, highly tracked category. We need to frame these metrics not just as boring regulatory checklists, but as a critical barometer for consumer trust and market vulnerability. Investors and watchdogs are actively using these exact metrics to see if a company is properly managing its risks. Communication with consumers is a vital piece of this industry, and the accuracy of what's on a label can literally make or break a product. Because the reality boils down to this simple equation: accuracy equals brand value. On the flip side, misleading claims, well, those equal direct financial liability. The SASB standards recognize that making misleading statements, or honestly, just failing to adapt to consumer demands for transparency, can severely damage a company's revenue. In an age where we are all hyper-aware of what we're consuming, an untrustworthy health claim isn't just a misstep, it's incredibly bad business.
Moving on to Section 2, targeting the next generation, looking specifically at advertising to children. Let's peek behind the curtain at one of the most heavily scrutinized areas in the entire beverage industry. Under the standard, an advertising impression on a child is basically calculated like this. It's the expected share of kids in the audience at the time of the media buy multiplied by the total expected impressions. And here's the kicker, it counts regardless of whether the advertising was actually directed at children. If a company buys a commercial slot during a primetime family sports broadcast and say 15% of that audience is historically expected to be under 12, those impressions count. They cannot just claim ignorance because the ad didn't feature a cartoon character.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scope of what constitutes an advertisement today. We aren't just talking about television and radio anymore. The standard forces companies to track impressions across the internet, third-party sites, mobile apps, and interactive games, which are often called advergames. It even includes licensed characters and celebrity endorsements. The net is cast incredibly wide to ensure true accountability in how the next generation is being targeted.
But the standard goes one brilliant step further, forcing a really sharp side-by-side contrast. Companies have to disclose the percentage of total advertising impressions made on children, and then, right next to it, the percentage of those impressions that actually promote products meeting established dietary guidelines. This metric instantly exposes whether a brand is simply blasting kids with ads for sugary sodas, or if they are responsibly pointing their marketing toward healthier, low-sugar alternatives that align with actual health criteria.
Which brings us to Section 3, the GMO transparency demand, focusing on ingredient clarity.
Consumers increasingly demand clear information about what is actually in their drinks, right? Well, to ensure that transparency, the SASB sets a very firm scientific baseline. They define GMOs as organisms except for human beings in which genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating or natural recombination. So, no gray areas. It removes all ambiguity so everybody knows exactly what needs to be tracked.
And here is how that transparency hits the wallet. The standard dictates that companies must disclose their revenue from products labeled as containing GMOs, and completely separate from that, the revenue from products labeled as non-GMO. By forcing them to track these two distinct revenue streams, it turns ingredient transparency directly into a hard financial metric. Investors can see plain as day how shifting consumer preferences, like say a huge market shift toward non-GMO beverages, is going to impact the company's bottom line.
All right, Section 4, the cost of deception.
let's look at the legal and financial repercussions.
So, what happens when a company breaks the rules? When a product has a misbranded label or uses deceptive health claims, the consequences escalate pretty fast. It usually starts with a formal warning letter. If that gets ignored, it steps up to a cease and desist order. And finally, it culminates in civil penalties and forced corrective advertising. And that last one is particularly painful for a brand because they are essentially forced to spend their own money to publicly admit they misled consumers. Ouch!
And this brilliantly illustrates the true scale of the risk. Look at these potential financial losses. Under civil actions, you've got massive judgments and settlements. Under regulatory proceedings, regulators can force penalties, disgorgement, which basically means forcing the company to hand back profits they made illegally, plus restitution to the consumers. And yes, in severe cases, there can even be criminal actions and judgments. Misbranded labeling is absolutely not just a minor oversight. It leads to massive financial liabilities.
Actually, wait, I want to highlight a truly staggering fact directly from the standard. When companies report their total monetary losses from these legal proceedings, those reported losses do not even include the legal fees and expenses they incurred in their defense. Think about that for a second. A company might report millions in settlements, but that doesn't account for the absolute army of corporate lawyers they had to pay for months or years to fight it. The true cost of deception is way, way higher than the sticker price on the penalty.
And that brings us to our final stop, Section 5, the bottom line, where we see that trust is a tangible asset.
Let's bring this all together. We've looked at the metrics, the definitions, and the penalties. What these SASB standards ultimately provide is a corporate accountability checklist. By forcing companies to track accurate ad impressions on youth across all platforms, to clarify their GMO versus non-GMO revenue, and to publicly detail their non-compliance incidents, they do something kind of magical. They transform this abstract, fluffy idea of brand trust into hard, auditable data. You can't just claim to be a reliable company anymore. You literally have to prove it on your balance sheet.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative question for you. Will your next drink purchase be driven by the shiny, marketing-optimized label slapped on the front of the bottle, or the auditable transparency and accountability backing it up? The data shows the market is shifting, and the companies that win will be the ones that treat accuracy not just as a legal requirement, but as their most valuable asset. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and remember, keep asking the right questions.